This, believe it or not, is the final word daily from the T20 World Cup, Day 16, the end of the group stage. It's finally over. And it was the big one. The grudge match, the battle of the heavyweights, Namibia versus India. I'm Jeff Lemon. Adam Collins is going to tell you all about that game in the space of 30 seconds or less.
All right, yes, Virat Kohli won the toss in his final game leading this Indian T20 team. Elected to bowl, Namibia made it to 132 for 8. They were helped along by 13 from the last over, but for the most part, it was about India's veteran spinners, Jadeja and Ashwin, taking 3 each. And then it was about India's openers, Rohit Sharma, a brisk half-century, Rahul, an unbeaten half-century, hitting the winning runs with 28 balls to spare. India victorious in this dead rubber by 9 wickets.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, there are times, I've got to admit, there are times when we're watching a cricket match and it happens to be a giant mismatch, and it happens to be a game that has no bearing on the result of the tournament, and it happens to involve staying up until 4 a.m. to do it. And it happens to involve us neglecting our loved ones, turning away from our friends, turning inward to the TV screen. And it brings to mind a quote from the poet James Wright when he said, "I have wasted my life." That's how I feel today.
I like how that's the quote. I was waiting for something quite profound as the rejoinder there, but no. I have wasted my life. Full stop, new paragraph. Yeah, and look, I get where you're coming from. I mean, look, today was about India's last game of the tournament. I mean, the fact that you can see what they were trying to do with the draw. Last game of the group, India playing Namibia, the biggest mismatch on paper in the competition. You can see what they were thinking. India hunting net run rate on the final day, excitement plus, but because it was all resolved yesterday, it had the other effects. So we're talking about Shastri finishing up as coach. We're talking about Kohli finishing up as captain. We're talking about Namibia putting in one final good effort with the bat. That's been a consistent theme of the last week, as did India. I mean, had they batted first, they would have made well over 200 on the trajectory they were on, thanks to Rohit and Rahul, and they really have found their straps with the bat. The problem is it's all in vain because they lost to Pakistan and New Zealand in their first 2 games, and really there's nothing they could have done from there due to other results. So, anticlimactic, but perhaps, Jeff, it's best to start with Namibia with that in mind, who did qualify unexpectedly and have held teams to account. They beat Scotland, of course, in quite dramatic fashion with 4 wickets in a hurry in Scotland's power play. But they've been far from mismatched throughout. I know they've lost heavily today, but it's not as though they've been all out for 50 or 60. They will improve from this. Their captain, Jared Erasmus, who we've heard a lot from through the tournament, said before play today that his team have inspired their nation to love cricket. And I certainly feel that. I get that vibe from them, that they're going to come back next year for the World Cup in 11 months' time in Australia. And look, they might take a scalp there. And in 5 years' time, they might be really pushing some of the bigger teams. They're on the right path.
I think it's very significant that they're in the top spotlight for the first time since 2003, that we're seeing Namibia at a World Cup taking on the major teams. I think when they were doing the scheduling for India's last match, they weren't expecting Namibia to qualify. They were expecting it to be against a slightly stronger opposition. But the way that Namibia stormed through the qualifying, they beat Ireland, they beat the Netherlands, who are a couple of teams who are very much senior to them in the associate pecking order, and in terms of the resources they've put into their sides and the amount of time they've had to build those teams. And then coming in and beating Scotland in the group stage as well. So they really were only held to a low score once against Afghanistan, and aside from that, they've given a really good account of themselves. Obviously, David Visa doing a lot of carrying of that team with bat and ball, but it hasn't been only him. Trumpelman's bowled really well through the tournament. Erasmus has scored runs. Williams has scored runs. There's been Jan Freilich has taken a stack of wickets through the tournament as well, as sort of unlikely looking seamer coming in to do that job. And I hope this does mean that there's an upward trajectory. It didn't really happen after the 2003 World Cup, but I hope that they can kick on from here.
Yeah, Michael van Lingen taking a couple of classy boundaries off Bumrah at the start. Stefan Bard with that beautiful clip off Shami for 6 in the power play. Trumpelman even with the bat, 13 from the last over, going after Shami again. He's had a poor tournament with the exception of the 2 games in the middle there. He went around against Pakistan and he went around again today. So, yeah, there are building blocks and you can't always say that at the end of a tournament about a team who's been beaten throughout, with the exception of the round 1 games and beating Scotland as well. But I do feel that way for Namibia. In terms of India with the ball, Jadeja 3 for 16, Ashwin 3 for 20, so 6 for 36 from 8 overs between the senior spinners. Bumrah finished with 2 for 19. Shami went around and they had one change, Rahul Chahar, who went around as well instead of Chakrabarti. So, yeah, what can you say? That they were always going to have the ability to turn the screws, India with the ball. And then you press fast forward to the chase and Rohit Sharma quickly out of the blocks, took on Visa, took on Schultz, and then Rahul was able to take over after Rohit was out to the slower ball, and so it went Suryakumar Yadav walking out at number 3 instead of Kohli, so he got the chance to finish it off, and maybe that'll be, I'm sure that will be written about as a bit of a passing of the baton of sorts. Kohli will still play in this team, but it'll be more made in the image of Suryakumar Yadav and KL Rahul. They'll have more of a say about the future direction of India in T20 cricket than Kohli and the departing coach Ravi Shastri.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one as to how much pressure comes on to Kohli for his spot, which sounds bizarre to say about someone averaging over 50 in the format, but his scoring rate has been an issue over the last year or two particularly. He's had more trouble. He's at his best, he was all about hitting the gaps as effortlessly as he found the boundary. So it wasn't just about boundary hitting, but it was the way that he worked strike, the way that he got twos particularly, more than just about anybody else. And in this tournament, it seems like he's had trouble just turning over strike a lot of the time. And so when you've got that many good T20 bats kicking around, then there will be pressure on that spot, but I suppose it's an air out of the balloon sort of campaign for India, and it has been from the start. They're a team where, look, 95% of the audience for the tournament basically switches off once they realise that India are probably getting knocked out, and it does seem really hard to get your head around the fact that they've got the biggest and the best and the flashiest T20 league in the world, and yet that hasn't produced a team that could compete, despite the fact the tournament was played in the same conditions.
Yeah, it feels as though they've missed a trick here. They had the chance to springboard out of the IPL, and that's not been the case. As you say, all of the resources at their disposal. Shastri finishing up today, and he hasn't led them to a white ball final. I mean, there's something amiss there. And I'm sure that'll be reviewed and pored over in the weeks and probably months to come. The fact that there's another World Cup in 11 months' time certainly helps with that. It doesn't mean that this generation to be thrown out the door and they start again or anything like it. This isn't England at the 2015 World Cup, for example. This is a very different framework. The fact that KL Rahul completed his third half century on the bounce, the fact that Kohli's endorsed Rohit Sharma as his successor, amusing as it was when Rohit Sharma was being doubted by certain quarters a couple of weeks ago, he remains one of the classiest operators in white ball cricket. No caveat there. So, look, again, they are going to be strong into the future. It's just that they've misfired at the wrong time of the tournament. You could say that the group didn't suit them either. Again, a little bit counterintuitive. You look at the groups on paper and you would think that the side of the draw that included Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, thus bolstering the full member nations, whilst on the other side of it, having Namibia and Scotland would be at the advantage of a team like India. But as Daniel Norcross made the point early on in the podcast, I mean, there was no latitude there. If you lost games early, it was very hard to get your way back into it, and so it played out. Whereas in the other group, there was no latitude in the other group either, as we saw with South Africa. But the very nature of the group system is such that you need to get off to a flyer. And had the draw been set up in such a way that India played the qualifiers early on, had they played Scotland and Namibia in the first 2 two games, or one of the two in the first two games, and got ahead of steam, well, look out New Zealand, let's say, for instance, towards the end of the competition. But that wasn't to be, because it does seem a fraction odd, Jeff, that Australia, for example, who've been pretty ordinary in this format in the last couple of years, are in the semi-finals. Now, had Australia played India, if Australia played India tomorrow, you would imagine that India would win if it were a T20 being played in the UAE. But as I say, such is the nature of this draw that Australia progressed to the final four later this week, and India are going home.
Yeah, and Australia will play Pakistan, which is going to be interesting. You would think that, Pakistan could be the kind of team who do something like blaze through the group stage unbeaten and then bomb out in a semi-final inexplicably. Like, you couldn't. But
do you feel that? Do you feel? I don't. I mean, whilst I share that sort of historical perspective on Pakistan cricket, everything is clicking with them right now, and I just get the sense that they have something special going on, and that Australia, the last time they came up against an absolute top-level quality team not even a fortnight ago, against England. I mean, they lost to England, and Steve Waugh said sack them all. That was 9 or 10 days ago, and England are rightly the favourite alongside Pakistan now that India are out of the equation, with Australia and New Zealand very much the third and fourth team in the semi-final stage. So it feels to me like the stage is set for Pakistan here to make a statement and then prove that they can take down England in the final, assuming that England do the business against the Black Caps.
Yeah, there's that gulf of quality, I suppose, but the Australian approach has worked. I've questioned it throughout, the lack of spin that they've had. They've picked their 3 test quicks and they've relied on them, and it has done the job so far. It really comes down to whether that continues to work for them, and maybe it's in Australia's interest, if they can bowl first and then make some inroads, then they may be able to get on top in that game.
Yeah, and the point I didn't get a chance to make the other night because I wasn't on the tools on Saturday, but if I had been England, I would have been tempted to have engineered it to have brought South Africa through with them, because first of all, Steve Waugh tried to do exactly that in 1999, so there was a precedent that they could have lent on there, the way that Australia beat the West Indies crawling to the finish line. I think they made 12 runs in the last 14 overs to do everything they could to get New Zealand punted out. That's the history of it. But the reason I would have done that is because, for all of what I said there about the golfing class and the fact that Pakistan look like they should have enough strength to overcome Australia, you wouldn't want to face Glenn Maxwell getting on one. He's been not out in their last 2 games, and Mitchell Marsh is hitting form at the right time, hitting the ball beautifully. David Warner played himself into form through the course of the tournament in a couple of chasing innings against Sri Lanka and then against the West Indies. So yes, whilst in theory, Pakistan, yes, clearly the 2 seed if England had a 1 seed in the final 4. Australia, you couldn't rule them out entirely. Speaking of England, Jason Roy has been ruled out today. He's going to be replaced by James Vince. We saw him injured yesterday, and they went to the scan, and the scan said no.
Will the curse of James Vince strike again? Because in the 2019 World Cup, when James Vince came in for Jason Roy, England proceeded to absolutely tank with him in the team, and couldn't win until Jason Roy came back into the side. So has there been a hex placed on James Vince? Has he offended some Hampshire witch? We'll find out.
I wonder whether he'll play. Interesting. We'll talk about this in the coming days on the final word, I'm sure. But do they go with James Vince up top, or does Bairstow open and then they have the room for Sam Billings? So I think there might be a temptation there for a bit of versatility down the list, given how effective Billings is in the death overs. Hall of Fame, thanks to Woodstock Cricket, as they are supporting the show every single day, every single month of the year. woodstockcricket.co.uk, the best cricket bats in the world. What a time to get your hands on one before Christmas. The offer code is TFW20. You'll find the information for that beneath the little bar here in the show notes. You can read all about woodstockcricket.co.uk, number 1 and number 2 for bats in England this year, and the 20% discount TFW20. I want to nominate, Jeff, today the response of Rishabh Pant when taking a fabulous catch from the bowling of Ashwin to remove Erasmus. There was no appeal. There was no celebration. It was a beauty. It was Rishabh Pant, who's copped some criticism for his wicket-keeping across the journey. He's a much improved stumper these days. He did execute a good leg side stumping earlier in the innings as well. But that catch was a ripper. And I think to me that kind of showed they were going through the motions to an extent. This was a team, I think Matt Roller popped on Twitter, or Ben Jones, one or the other. I sometimes interchange our two young friends. That India only rocked up 80 minutes before the game today. No criticism, just, emblematic of the fact that this was the end of the road, and Rishabh Pant, one of the more excitable characters in world cricket, not even he could get himself up and elated about taking a great catch off Ashwin.
I think Hall of Fame for me is just Ashwin being allowed to play a game, coming in. He's been in the squad, been sitting around, but coming in and being so effective in the way that he has. India they just don't trust him in the first 11 very often for this format, but hopefully there'll be a little bit more of that going forward.
Yeah, I suspect so. He's bowled really well in his couple of opportunities in this tournament. It feels as though Ashwin Jadeja, as it's been at the back end of the group stage, set and forget. That's it as far as the group stage is concerned on the Final Word Daily. We'll be back for the semi-finals later in the week. Stay in touch with us in all the usual ways on social media. Hit subscribe, tell your friends. We're going to be here for the 3 deciding games. We make 2 podcasts a week. In addition to that, the weekly show, which starts again next week, and Storytime, our history show that comes out every Saturday. And if you really like what we do on The Final Word, patreon.com/The Final Word, also in our show notes. If you want to be a financial contributor, subscriber, and get involved in continuing the conversation on our Discord channel. India, big winners by 9 wickets in their final game. Signing off, Adam Collins and Jeff Lemon. We'll talk on The Final Word later in the week.